She was 9 years old, barefoot, and sorting through garbage behind the Fulton Street Market in downtown Chicago. The rain had turned the pavement slick, the smell of spoiled food mixing with car exhaust. No one looked at her twice, except one man. Alexander Cole, billionaire CEO of the Cole Foundation, had just left a business summit about global sustainability. He stopped dead in his tracks as the little girl, small and grimy, reached into a dumpster and pulled out a half-eaten sandwich. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything he thought he knew about himself and about family. What would you do if you saw a child like that? Stay with me, because what happens next will shock you. She looked up when she sensed his presence. Her eyes, gray, steady too old for her age, met his for only a second before she turned back to the trash bags. Alexander had seen desperation before, but something about this child froze him. The world seemed to narrow down to that alley, that heartbeat, that tiny figure clutching a torn backpack. His driver called from the car. "Sir, we're late." But Alexander couldn't move. He watched as the girl placed the sandwich in a cracked plastic container and tucked it carefully inside her bag, as if it were treasure. "Hey, kid," he said quietly, stepping closer. "Where are your parents?" She hesitated, glancing toward the street like a frightened stray. "It's just me and my mom," she finally whispered. "She's sick. I'm just finding dinner." Her voice was polite, practiced. Too polite for someone digging through garbage. Alexander felt a knot tighten in his chest. He handed her a paper bag from the backseat leftover pastries from the hotel catering. "Here, fresh food, take it." She blinked, unsure if it was a trick. "It's okay," he said. "No one's going to take it back." The girl nodded and took the bag, her fingers trembling. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila," she said softly. "Leela what?" "Just Leela," she replied, then smiled faintly. "That's what Mom calls me." Her hair clung to her forehead, soaked from the drizzle. But her smile, small and shy, was bright enough to pierce the gray afternoon. Alexander crouched down to her level. "Do you go to school?" "Leela," she shook her head. "Not since Mom got sick. I want to go, but books cost more than food." Her honesty hit him harder than any corporate crisis ever had. For years, he'd built towers of glass and steel across the city, spoken about empowering communities. Yet here stood the proof of how little he'd really seen. A gust of wind blew through the alley, and as she pushed her hair back, he saw something glint around her neck, a small silver locket, scratched but familiar. His heartbeat stumbled. It looked exactly like the one he had given someone long ago, someone he had lost. "Where did you get that necklace?" he asked, his tone sharper than he meant. She stepped back, startled. "It was my mom's," she said. "She said it's lucky." Alexander's mouth went dry. "Your mom's name, what's her name?" Grace Lila said simply. "Grace Miller." The sound of it felt like a punch. Grace. The woman he'd loved and left behind a decade ago when his mother forced him to choose between love and the family empire. He had chosen wrong and spent years pretending not to feel it. He straightened, slowly, his thoughts spinning. Could it be the same? Grace, no, it couldn't. Yet the necklace, the eyes, the quiet strength, it all fit too well. His driver called again. "Sir, we really need to go." Alexander looked back at the limousine, then at the girl. She was already turning away, heading toward a narrow stairwell that led to the basement of an old building. "Wait," he called. She paused. "Do you and your mom live here?" She nodded. "It's warm when the heater works." He didn't know what to say. The billionaire with private jets and penthouses couldn't find a single word. Finally, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp bill. "Take this. Buy some real food, okay?" She shook her head. "Mom says never to take money from strangers. He smiled sadly. Then buy her medicine instead. After a long pause, she took it. Thank you, mister. She started to walk away, then turned back. Mom says good people are rare. You don't look mean, so maybe you're one of them. Her words struck deeper than she could know. He watched until she disappeared into the shadows. Back in the car, Alexander sat silent as the city lights smeared past the window. His mind replayed every second of that encounter, the locket, the name, the eyes. For years, he'd believed his past was buried under business deals and charity galas. But now, a small girl from the trash had cracked open something he thought was long dead. "Sir, are you all right?" the driver asked. Yes, Alexander said, though he didn't believe it. He looked out into the rain-soaked streets. Somewhere out there, a sick woman named Grace and a girl named Lila were fighting to survive. And he couldn't shake the feeling that he owed them more than kindness. Much more. Alexander couldn't stop thinking about her. For days, the image of that little girl beside the dumpster barefoot, holding that silver locket, wouldn't leave his mind. In meetings, while people pitched numbers and expansion plans, his thoughts kept drifting to her name. Lila. Every time he said it silently, it felt like a memory trying to surface. He told himself it was just guilt, the kind every billionaire feels when confronted with the real world beyond tinted windows. But deep down, he knew this was different. This was personal. On the fourth day, he told his driver to skip the office and take him back to the Fulton Street Market. The same cracked pavement, the same noise of vendors shouting prices, but no sign of the girl. He circled the area twice before he spotted her at a small diner's side door, handing a bag of bottles to the kitchen worker for coins. She looked thinner than before, her hoodie too big for her small frame. When she saw him, she froze like a rabbit caught in headlights. "Hey, Lila," he said softly, careful not to scare her. "Do you remember me?" Her lips twitched into a cautious smile. "The man with the pastries," she said. "That's me." He handed her another paper bag. "You hungry?" She nodded, took it, and sat on the curb. "It's warm," she whispered as she opened it. Inside was a burger and fries from a downtown cafe. She ate slowly, politely, as if each bite needed permission. Alexander sat beside her. "How's your mom?" "She's tired all the time," Lila said between bites. "Sometimes she can't stand up, but she says I'm brave, so I try to be." He swallowed the ache in his throat. "All she getting treatment?" "We go to the free clinic when we can, but it's hard when she can't walk that far." He looked at her, this tiny child carrying the weight of survival with the calm of an adult. "Would it be okay if I helped her?" he asked. "I know a doctor." Her fork paused in midair. "You don't have to. We're fine." He smiled gently. "You said the same thing about food, remember?" The next morning, Alexander called in a favor from the head of St. Mary's Medical Center, one of the many hospitals under his company's charitable wing. By afternoon, a car picked up Grace and Lila from their basement apartment. Grace resisted, at first pale and trembling, until she heard his name. "Alexander Cole," she repeated weakly, eyes widening in disbelief. He stood by the hospital doorway, unsure whether to approach her. She looked older, thinner, but unmistakably her. Grace Miller, the woman he'd once promised the world to and then lost. When their eyes met, time folded. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The silence between them said everything. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered finally. "I didn't ask for help." "I know," he said quietly, "but you need it." Her gaze softened exhaustion, winning over pride. "You haven't changed much." "Maybe not enough," he said. Over the next week, he visited daily. Grace was treated for a severe infection and chronic anemia. Doctors assured him she'd recover with time. Lila stayed close often, sitting by her mother's bedside with a coloring book. She didn't speak much when he was around, but her eyes followed him constantly. Once she showed him a page she'd drawn a tall building with shining windows. "That's where you live?" she asked. Something like that, he smiled. "I want to build one someday," she said, "but smaller, so everyone can have one." It was such a simple statement, yet it pierced him. He'd built skyscrapers for prestige, profit, and press, but this child dreamed of building shelter. He saw in her a reflection of who he once was before ambition became armor. One afternoon, while waiting for Grace's test results, he wandered into her hospital room. On the bedside table lay a faded envelope with the Coal Corporation logo, his company's logo. Inside was an old photo of Grace in her 20s, standing in front of a coal construction site, wearing a hard hat and smiling. He remembered that project. It was the Savannah Marina Hotel. And he remembered the day the photo was taken, the night they had first confessed their feelings under the same stars reflected in the water. His hands trembled. Grace had kept this photo all these years. When she woke, she found him holding it. "You still have this?" he asked quietly. She smiled faintly. "It reminded me of a time when life felt possible." He looked at her. "Why didn't you ever call me? I tried," she said. "Your mother answered." He didn't need to hear more. He already knew what that meant. His mother had always drawn sharp lines between their kind and ours. Grace had been the girl from the wrong side of those lines, and he had been too weak to cross them. That evening, when he offered to move Grace and Lila into a better place after her discharge, she hesitated. "We're used to little things," she said. "We don't need much. It's not about what you need," he said softly. "It's what you deserve." The following week, he arranged a small apartment near Lincoln Park, safe, warm, filled with light. Lila ran from room to room, laughing at the echo of her own footsteps. Grace stood by the window, tears shining in her tired eyes. "You didn't have to do this," she said again. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." Lila came running, holding a notebook. "Look," she said proudly. "I'm going to school now. I'm going to be an engineer." Alexander smiled. "Then, I guess I'd better make sure you have the best teachers." "You don't have to," she said earnestly. "Mom says kindness doesn't need promises." Her words landed deep. That night, as he drove home through the city, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set in motion, something bigger than charity or guilt. When he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's smile, Lila's determined little face, and that same silver locket glinting under the hospital lights. For years he had chased success to fill the silence inside him. But now that silence was whispering one name, Lila. He told himself it was just coincidence, but his heart refused to believe it. It started with a question Alexander couldn't stop asking himself: why did Lila feel so familiar? Weeks had passed since Grace and her daughter moved into the new apartment, and yet the thought haunted him every time he saw the girl. She had the same quiet resilience Grace once had, the same half-smile that appeared when she was trying to be brave. And those eyes, gray, soft, unyielding, were the same eyes that used to look at him across candlelight 10 years ago, back when life still felt full of promise. He told himself it was just coincidence, but the mind has a cruel way of circling back to what the heart already knows. One afternoon, while Grace was resting, he stopped by their apartment with some groceries. Lila greeted him at the door, beaming. "Mom's sleeping," she said. "But I can make you tea. I learned how from her." He followed her into the kitchen, amused by her confidence. The small apartment had begun to feel lived in, books stacked by the window, a vase with fresh daisies drawings taped to the fridge. He noticed one in particular, 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing at the tallest figure. "That's Mom," Lila said. "And that's me." "The man is—" She hesitated. "I don't know yet, But Mom says everyone has someone who looks out for them even if they don't know who it is. Her tone was casual, but something about it made his throat tighten. As he was leaving, he noticed the silver locket again. "Can I see that?" he asked. Lila nodded and unclasped it, handing it to him. Inside was a tiny faded photo Grace in her 20s, smiling, and beside her, him. Alexander felt the world tilt. It was taken during a charity event long before his mother had driven them apart. His own face stared back at him, younger, softer, still, naive enough to believe love was stronger than fear. He looked at Lila. "Did your mom ever tell you who this man is?" "No," she said, puzzled. "Just that he was a good man once." That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He sat in his penthouse surrounded by everything money could buy, yet all he could feel was emptiness pressing on his chest. He dug through old boxes in his study until he found a file marked Savannah Project 2013, the year he'd last seen Grace. Inside were employee lists, payroll slips, and one handwritten resignation letter. "Dear Mr. Cole," it began, "I'm leaving the company. Please don't worry about me. You have a future I don't belong in. I wish you well. Grace Miller." The paper trembled in his hands. The date was exactly 9 months before Lila's birthday on the school enrollment form. He stared at the numbers until they blurred. "My God," he whispered, "she's mine." The next morning, he went to Grace's apartment early. Lila was still asleep on the couch, curled under a blanket. Grace opened the door, startled to see him. "Alexander. Is something wrong?" He stepped inside, his voice low. Shaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" She froze. "Tell you what?" He pulled the locket from his pocket and placed it on the table. "That she's my daughter." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Thick, heavy, impossible. Grace sank into a chair, her face pale. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," she whispered. "Then how was I supposed to find out?" His voice cracked. "Through a stranger. Through her eyes, Grace, you kept my child from me." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You don't understand, Alexander. When your mother sent me away, I had nothing. I was pregnant and terrified. I wrote you letters, but she made sure you never got them. I didn't want to ruin your life with a scandal. So I raised her myself. I did the best I could." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "You thought keeping her secret would protect me. You robbed me of 10 years of her life. Her first steps, her first words." Grace stood trembling. "I know, and I have hated myself for it every single day. But I also knew that if you came for us back then, your mother would destroy you and her. I couldn't let that happen." Her words cracked something inside him. The anger dissolved into grief. He sat beside her, his voice soft. "She's brilliant, Grace. She wants to be an engineer. She has your heart. She has your stubbornness." Grace said, a ghost of a smile appearing. "I see you in her every day." When Lila woke and wandered into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, the air shifted. "Are you crying, Mom?" she asked. Grace knelt, hugging her tightly. "No, sweetheart. We're just talking about something important." Alexander crouched beside them, unsure how to begin. "Lila," he said gently, "there's something I want to tell you." She looked at him with those gray eyes, his eyes, and waited. I think I'm your father." Lila blinked, confused at first. "You mean like my real dad?" He nodded. "Yes. I didn't know before, but I know now." She was silent for a moment, trying to process the words. Then, without warning, she threw her arms around him. "I knew you were different," she whispered. "Mom always said my dad was kind. You helped us when nobody else did. I think God sent you back." Alexander felt tears rise unbidden. He wrapped his arms around her small shoulders, holding her as if to make up for every year he had lost. Grace watched from the corner, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears running freely down her face. That night, the three of them sat together for the first time as a family. They didn't talk much. Words felt too small for what they'd discovered. Lila sat between them, sketching buildings in her notebook, humming softly. Grace leaned against the couch, exhausted, but peaceful. Alexander stared at the two of them, a feeling he hadn't known in years flooding through him, belonging. He knew the road ahead would be hard. His mother would never accept Grace. The press would feast on the story of a billionaire and his secret child. But none of that mattered anymore. For the first time, he knew who he was not, Alexander Cole, the empire builder, but Alexander, father of Lila. As he tucked her in that night, Lila reached out half asleep and whispered, "Good night, Dad." He stood there for a long time after the sound of that single word echoing through every empty space inside him, healing places he didn't know were broken. The revelation changed everything. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt stripped of every illusion that power and money had built around him. All his achievements, the gleaming towers, the award galas, the endless headlines meant nothing compared to the quiet sound of Lila calling him Dad. But that moment of peace didn't last long. The past, the one he'd buried under corporate deals and success stories, was already rising to challenge everything he'd just found. When his mother Eleanor Cole discovered the truth, it was through whispers at her country club. "Your son's been seen visiting a woman from the old construction staff," someone had murmured, "and a child who looks just like him." Eleanor arrived at Alexander's penthouse the next evening, her face cold, elegant, and full of restrained fury. "Tell me this isn't true," she said the moment he opened the door. Alexander didn't flinch. "It's true, Mother. Her name is Grace Miller. The girl's name is Lila." Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Do you know what people will say? You're the head of Cole Enterprises. You can't tie our name to 'he cut her off.' To what? To a woman you threw away because she wasn't born into your world. To a child who had to eat from the trash because of your decisions." The silence that followed was heavy. For once, Eleanor had no words. Alexander looked at her not with anger but with a calm she hadn't seen in him since he was young. "I'm done hiding, Mother. I lost them once because I was too afraid of you. That won't happen again." He left her standing there, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hall. That night he went to Grace's apartment and told her everything, his mother's fury, the gossip that was spreading, the possibility that the board might turn on him. Grace listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "I never wanted to destroy your name," she said softly. "You didn't," he replied. "You saved it. You reminded me what it's supposed to stand for." In the weeks that followed, Alexander began to change the company from within. He diverted millions from luxury projects to community housing programs. He created scholarships for children from low-income families, naming the initiative the Lila Foundation. The press called it a redemption arc, a billionaire trying to buy forgiveness. But the people who worked under him saw something else, a man rebuilding not his empire but his soul. Grace and Lila moved into his home soon after. At first, the mansion felt too large, too empty for their laughter. But slowly, it came alive. Grace filled the kitchen with warmth, cooking simple meals she'd once scraped to afford. Lila's laughter echoed in every hallway, her sketches taped to the marble walls. Alexander traded board meetings for school drop-offs, gala dinners for bedtime stories. Still, his mother's disapproval hung over them like a storm cloud. Eleanor didn't visit, though Alexander knew she followed every headline. What she didn't know was that her absence no longer defined him. One afternoon, as Grace sat in the garden reading, Alexander joined her. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Regret what us?" "Everything we lost." Grace smiled faintly. "No. I regret that we didn't fight sooner, but sometimes life waits until you're strong enough to face it." Her words stayed with him. They became his compass as he rebuilt his company, his relationships, and himself. When the board tried to oust him for diverting funds, he stood his ground. "If all we build are towers for profit," he told them, "then we're not builders, we're thieves of hope." The vote to remove him failed by one margin. That night, Grace and Lila met him at the office with takeout burgers, celebrating quietly in the glow of the city lights. Then something unexpected happened. Eleanor called. Her voice on the phone was weaker than he remembered. "I want to meet her," she said simply. "The girl, your daughter." When Eleanor arrived the next day, she was met by a nervous but curious Lila, holding a bouquet of daisies. "You're my grandma," Lila said shyly. "I picked these for you." Eleanor took the flowers with trembling hands, her mask of pride cracking. "Thank you, dear," she said. "They're beautiful." For a long moment they simply stood there, the woman who'd built walls her whole life, and the child who'd broken them with one small act of kindness. That evening, Eleanor stayed for dinner. It wasn't easy. There were pauses, heavy with old pain glances, filled with unspoken words. But when Lila began telling stories about school, about wanting to be an engineer like her mom dreamed of, Eleanor listened. Truly listened. By dessert, she was smiling a real human smile that Alexander hadn't seen since his father's funeral. After Eleanor left, Grace turned to Alexander. "Do you think she'll ever really accept us?" He nodded slowly. "She already has. She just doesn't know it yet." Months passed. Lila thrived in her new school. Grace, once fragile, began consulting for one of Alexander's housing projects, designing eco-friendly shelters for single mothers. Alexander found balance at last work that built more than wealth love, that asked for nothing but truth. One evening, as the three of them watched the city skyline from the terrace, Lila pointed at one of the towers glowing in the distance. "Is that one yours, Dad?" she asked. "It used to be," he said. "Now it's ours." Grace smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You've changed, Alex." He looked at her and shook his head gently. "No, I just remembered who I was supposed to be." In that quiet moment between the fading sunlight and the hum of the city, he finally understood redemption. It wasn't about fixing what was broken, it was about building something better from the pieces. Years later, the skyline of Chicago shimmered under a gold evening sun. From the rooftop of the Cole Foundation headquarters, laughter and applause echoed through the air. Reporters, philanthropists, and government officials gathered for the 10th anniversary of the Lila Foundation, a project that had started with one child found beside a dumpster. Alexander Cole stood near the podium, hands resting on the railing, watching his daughter address the crowd below. Lila, now 17, spoke with the calm authority of someone much older. Her voice carried strength, confidence, and compassion. "When I was little," she said, "I used to think that some people were born to shine, and others were meant to stay in the dark, but I was wrong. The truth is, everyone can shine when someone gives them light." The audience grew still. 10 years ago, a man gave my mother and me that light. He didn't just change our lives, he reminded us that kindness can rewrite any story. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. Grace, standing beside him, reached for his hand. Her touch grounded him, pulling him back from the emotion that threatened to spill over. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire or a CEO or a man trying to repair the past. He was just a father watching his daughter become everything he'd once hoped for. When the applause faded and the lights dimmed, Lila joined them backstage, grinning ear to ear. "Did I do okay?" she asked. "You were incredible," Grace said, pulling her into a hug. Alexander smiled, his voice warm but steady. You spoke like someone who knows where she came from and where she's going. I learned from the best, Lila said. Both of you. After the event, they drove out of the city toward Lincoln Park, where the foundation had built a new community center. The walls were covered with murals painted by children, the kind who once lived the same life Lila had known. Some were now in college, others apprenticing as engineers or designers under the foundation's programs. Alexander paused in front of a mural of a girl reaching toward the stars, her hands glowing with color. Below it, in small print, the artist had signed, "For the man who taught me that trash doesn't define worth." Grace stepped beside him. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Every single one, the rain, the market, the look in her eyes." "You mean the look that scared you half to death," she teased. He chuckled, "The one that reminded me of what I'd lost, and what I still had a chance to find." They stood in silence for a while, watching the children play outside the center's glass doors. It wasn't the skyscrapers or the headlines that defined Alexander's success anymore. It was the laughter of kids who had a future, the kind of sound money could never buy. Later that evening, as they walked home through the park, Eleanor Cole joined them, her steps slow but steady. Age had softened her, humbling the sharpness that once ruled her every word. She had become a frequent visitor now, always bringing gifts for Lila or baked goods for Grace. Time, it seemed, had finally taught her the lesson she once refused to learn. "Your speech was beautiful, darling," Eleanor told Lila, taking her hand. "Your grandfather would have been proud." "Thank you, Grandma," Lila said, smiling. "But you know it was your son who made it all happen." Eleanor looked at Alexander with quiet affection. "He's done more good in the last decade than I ever did in my lifetime," she said softly. "I used to think legacy was about money. Turns out it's about what you leave in people's hearts." Alexander nodded, emotion tightening his chest. "You taught me to build, Mom. I just learned to build differently." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You built something that lasts." When they returned home that night, Lila ran upstairs to finish her scholarship essay. She'd just been accepted into Stanford's engineering program. Grace went to the kitchen humming as she made tea. Alexander stood on the terrace overlooking the city. The skyline glittered, the same skyline that once represented everything he thought he wanted. Now it felt smaller, almost human. Grace joined him, two steaming mugs in her hands. "You're quiet tonight," she said. "Just thinking," he replied, "about how fast it all went. How a single moment a child by a dumpster changed everything." She smiled. "Sometimes it only takes one act of grace to save a life." He looked at her and smiled back. "You always had a way with words." "I had to," she said playfully. "I was raising your daughter." They both laughed softly, the sound mingling with the hum of the city. After a pause, Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out the same silver locket, restored and polished. It survived everything he said. Grace traced her finger over its surface. "It's seen everything, too. Maybe it's time Lila had it." He nodded, placing it on the table beside her. "Tomorrow." The next morning, Lila came down dressed for school. She found the locket waiting by her breakfast plate. Inside was the old photo of Grace and Alexander, the one that had once revealed their secret. This time, a new photo had been added, one of all three of them together taken in the garden the week before. She looked up at her parents, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'll take care of it," she whispered. "You already have," Alexander said. Years from now, people would tell the story of Alexander Cole, the billionaire, who found a girl in the trash and changed her life. But those who truly knew him understood it wasn't about saving her. It was about her saving him. As the morning light streamed through the windows, Grace placed her hand in his. "You know," she said softly, "life came full circle." Alexander looked toward the skyline and nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with peace. "And this time, we finished the circle right." The city stretched before them, vast and alive, but for the first time Alexander didn't feel small beneath it. He had built towers, lost love, found family, and learned the one truth that had eluded him for most of his life, that the greatest empire a man can build is the one made of love, forgiveness, and home. When we look back on Alexander Cole's journey, it's impossible not to see how one ordinary moment changed an extraordinary life. He began as a man who had everything the world could offer: power, wealth, reputation, but carried an emptiness he couldn't name. For years, he built skyscrapers that touched the clouds but forgot what it felt like to touch a heart. Then, one rainy afternoon, he saw a little girl scavenging for food behind a market. A girl who would unknowingly dismantle every illusion he had ever built. That moment of compassion led him back to his own humanity, back to the woman he once loved, and finally to the daughter he never knew existed. Lila didn't just remind him of the life he lost, she revealed the man he was meant to become. In her courage, he saw the strength he had buried. In her dreams, he rediscovered his purpose. Grace, the woman who had once been cast out of his world, became the mirror that reflected his redemption. Together, they formed something far stronger than the empire he'd built, a family forged not by bloodline or status but by forgiveness, resilience, and love. Through every trial, the confrontation with his mother, the shame of his past, the struggle to balance wealth with worth, Alexander learned the greatest truth of all redemption is never about erasing mistakes, but about facing them with grace. When he chose to stand by Grace and Lila, even at the cost of his public image and power, he redefined what success meant. No longer was it about profits or prestige, it became about purpose. It was about using his resources not to dominate the world, but to heal the parts of it that were broken, starting with himself. The empire he once built out of ambition transformed into a legacy of compassion. The Cole Foundation became a beacon of hope, supporting children, like Lila, those who had been unseen, unheard, and forgotten by society. His mother, Eleanor, once the symbol of cold privilege, softened with time and humility, finding peace in the love of a granddaughter, who saw her not as a matriarch, but as grandma. Grace, once burdened by fear and poverty, became a leader in her own right, a woman whose strength outshined every scar the world had given her. And Lila, the girl from the trash, became the living proof that light can be found in the darkest places. Alexander's story teaches us that no one is too lost to be found, and no mistake is too great to be redeemed. Sometimes life tears us apart so that we can be rebuilt stronger, kinder, more awake to the things that truly matter. We spend years chasing dreams that others tell us to want: status, titles, applause, only to realize that what fills the heart is far simpler love that forgives, time that's shared, and compassion that costs us something real. His transformation wasn't sudden. It came through choices made in small, quiet moments. The choice to stop his car and notice a child in need, the choice to listen instead of judge, the choice to act even when it hurt. And that's the lesson for us all. Greatness doesn't come from what we own or achieve, but from how we respond when the universe places someone fragile in our path. Do we look away, or do we stop, listen, and reach out a hand? Every one of us at some point will stand where Alexander stood, faced with a moment that tests our humanity. It might not be as dramatic as finding a child in the rain, but it might be a friend who needs help, a stranger who needs understanding, or a loved one who needs forgiveness. In those moments, remember his story. Remember that compassion is not weakness, it's the greatest power we possess. And maybe, just maybe, there's a part of Alexander in all of us the part that has been lost in the noise, chasing meaning in the wrong places, waiting for something to remind us of who we really are. The truth is, you don't need to be a billionaire to make a difference. You just need the courage to care. So, if this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect on what really matters, take a moment today to do one small act of kindness. Call someone you've drifted from. Help someone who can't repay you. Forgive someone who once broke you. That's how healing begins, not in grand gestures, but in humble moments where love wins over pride. And if stories like this move you, if they remind you that hope still exists, even in the hardest places, then please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring more real, heartfelt stories to life, stories that inspire, heal, and remind us all that no matter how dark life gets, there's always a light waiting to be found. Because sometimes the story that saves you isn't just the one you watch, it's the one you take to heart.